Hello, Virgo. Uh, there is a particular kind of silence that exists between two people who were once close. Not the clean silence of a natural ending. Not the peaceful silence of two people who simply moved in different directions and carried no unfinished weight with them, but the charged kind. The kind that carries everything that was never said, everything that happened in the space between the last real conversation and the moment when the speaking simply stopped. And some of you, Virgo, specifically know this silence from the inside. You have been living adjacent to it, feeling its presence in the peripheral vision of your daily life, not always consciously, not always with the full weight of it acknowledged, but there nonetheless. That particular density of an unresolved connection hovering somewhere just outside the frame of ordinary experience. If this found you today, I think the part of you that has been quietly carrying this already knows that something in this silence has been waiting, not forever, but with a patience that has its own particular quality to be looked at directly. A theme appearing strongly in this reflection is the specific emotional landscape of Virgo navigating a severed connection, because Virgo, and this is worth naming, tends to process silence differently than most. There is a particular quality to the Virgo mind that continues working on unresolved things long after the external situation appears to have ended, that reviews, reconsiders, examines from multiple angles, applies the particular quality of Virgo discernment to the question of what actually happened and why and what it means. And the thing about that kind of thorough private processing is that it can both be a gift and a form of prolonged exposure. A gift because it produces genuine understanding, real clarity about the nature of what occurred and what role everyone played in it. And a form of prolonged exposure because it keeps the processing alive in the interior long after it might otherwise have found a natural resting place. An energy that may be present for many Virgos right now is the particular exhaustion of having carried the full weight of an unresolved situation largely alone. Because Virgo tends not to distribute that weight outward easily, tends not to speak freely about the complexity of what is being processed internally, tends instead to hold it with the same careful, controlled quality that Virgo brings to most things, managing it, containing it, ensuring that the outward expression of it remains proportionate and dignified even when the interior experience is considerably more complex than that. And a pattern worth noticing here is that this particular quality of solitary carrying, however characteristic and however admirable in its own way, has its own cost. A cost that tends to accumulate quietly over time until it becomes something that the body and the psyche begin to push back against. A pattern that sometimes emerges in Virgo's relationship with estrangement is that the silence itself becomes a kind of decision that was made once and then never fully revisited. Not because the original reasons for it weren't real, they may have been entirely real, entirely valid, entirely necessary in the moment they produced the silence, but because Virgo, having made a decision through a genuine process of discernment, tends not to easily reopen the question, tends to consider the matter settled in a way that may not fully account for the fact that things change, that people change, that the landscape of a situation revisited from a distance sometimes looks different than it did from within it. And An energy appearing here is a gentle but persistent invitation to allow the question to be reopened, not because the original conclusion was necessarily wrong, but because the current moment may be asking for a fresh assessment that the previous one made in the heat or the hurt or the exhaustion of whatever produced the silence may not have had access to. And there is something specifically, Virgo, about the difficulty of reopening a settled question. Because for Virgo, the process of arriving at a conclusion is rarely quick or casual. It tends to be thorough, considered, arrived at through genuine effort, which means that revisiting it carries a particular implicit challenge, the suggestion, however unintended, that the original process was insufficient, that something was missed, that the discernment that Virgo takes such quiet, genuine pride in was somehow incomplete. And a pattern worth noticing here is that this particular sensitivity can occasionally cause Virgo to hold a concluded position longer than the actual situation warrants, simply because the cost of revision feels like it reflects something unfavorable about the quality of the original analysis. But revisiting a conclusion as new information becomes available is not a sign of incomplete discernment. It is, in fact, its most sophisticated expression. This reflection invites you to consider what the original decision to stop speaking actually cost you, not just what it protected you from, but what it also removed from your life, and whether the full accounting of that cost has ever been honestly completed. Here's the thing about Virgo and estrangement. The silence rarely comes from a place of not caring. It almost always comes from the opposite place, from caring deeply enough that the pain of the situation reached a threshold where continued engagement felt genuinely unsustainable, where the choice to withdraw was not indifference but a form of self-preservation, the quiet, dignified, very Virgo act of removing oneself from a dynamic that was no longer serving either person's genuine well-being. And that choice deserves to be honored and not questioned out of guilt, not second guessed because of social pressure or the passage of time alone, but honored as the genuine act of discernment it was. And yet, here is the complexity that Virgo often navigates in private. The honoring of the original decision does not necessarily preclude the possibility that something has shifted, that the conditions which made the silence necessary have evolved, that the person on the other side of it, or the connection itself, or the specific dynamic that made it untenable, may be in a different place now than when the silence began. And a theme appearing here is not the suggestion that the silence was wrong. It is the suggestion that it may be worth looking at with the full, unguarded, genuinely open quality of Virgo discernment, applied not to the past but to the present, not to what was true then but to what is true now. This reflection invites you to consider what you actually believe about this person now, not what the pain of the original situation made you believe, not what the narrative constructed in the silence has solidified into, but what your most honest and current assessment of this person and this connection actually is, if you allow yourself to look at it with fresh eyes. An energy that may be present in this moment is one of unfinished business finding its way back to the surface. Not because it was suppressed. Virgo rarely suppresses things in the true sense of the word. The processing happens, it simply happens internally. But because some connections carry a particular kind of incompletion that tends to recirculate, that returns periodically in the form of a thought or a dream or a moment when something triggers the memory with unusual clarity. And the return of that kind of recirculation, the fact that this connection keeps finding its way back into awareness despite the official status of the silence, is itself worth paying attention to. Not as proof that something must be done, but as information, as the interior's way of indicating that something here has not yet reached its natural resolution. An energy that may be present in this moment is one of unfinished business finding its way back to the surface. Not because it was suppressed. Virgo rarely suppresses things in the true sense of the word. The processing happens, it simply happens internally. But because some connections carry a particular kind of incompletion that tends to recirculate, that returns periodically in the form of a thought or a dream or a moment when something triggers the memory with unusual clarity. And the return of that kind of recirculation, the fact that this connection keeps finding its way back into awareness despite the official status of the silence, is itself worth paying attention to. Not as proof that something must be done, but as information, as the interior's way of indicating that something here has not yet reached its natural resolution. And here is something that Virgo sometimes overlooks in the management of an unresolved connection. The interior doesn't lie. It may be overruled. It may be redirected. It may be told firmly and repeatedly that the matter is settled and there is nothing left to process. But it doesn't lie. And when the same thread keeps surfacing despite the official conclusion, when the same face or the same dynamic or the same question keeps returning to the edges of conscious awareness with that particular quality of still active, still present, still unresolved, that persistence is the interior's most honest communication. It is saying something here is not finished yet, not necessarily in the sense of requiring action, but in the sense of requiring genuine attention. The kind of attention that looks at what is actually present rather than what was decided to be present when the silence was established. There is a particular Virgo experience of this that is worth naming directly. The part where the mind has constructed a very thorough and well-reasoned case for why the silence was correct, why it needs to continue, why the considerations that led to it remain valid, and the heart, operating on a different logic entirely, continues to carry something that the mind's case has never fully addressed. That gap between the mind's reasonable conclusion and the heart's unreasonable persistence is not a flaw in Virgo's processing. It is information. It is the interior's acknowledgement that the situation is more complex than any single framework, however well constructed, can fully contain. A theme worth sitting with here is the difference between a silence that has completed its purpose and one that has become a habit. A silence that served a genuine need and was the right response to a genuine situation tends, over time, to settle into something that feels genuinely resolved. The weight lifts. The periodic recirculation stops or becomes very infrequent. The connection is held in memory without the particular charged quality of something still active. but a silence that has become a habit that continues, not because it is still actively serving the original purpose, but because it has simply become the established state of things, tends to feel different. It tends to maintain that particular density of the unresolved, that quality of something still present that the silence has never quite managed to fully contain. This reflection invites you to consider which of those two kinds of silence, this is the completed kind or the habitual kind, and whether your most honest interior experience, if you allow it to speak without the mind immediately managing its answer, confirms the version of events that the official narrative has settled on. And this is where it gets both subtle and important, because Virgo, more than most, tends to be right about the things Virgo decides. The discernment is real, the pattern recognition is real. The ability to assess a situation with accuracy and arrive at a conclusion that holds up over time, that is genuinely one of Virgo's most reliable capacities. And the silence, in most cases, was arrived at through exactly that kind of genuine discernment. It was not impulsive, it was not reactive in the way that less careful signs sometimes are. It was, in characteristically Virgo fashion, considered, but even genuinely discerning conclusions can benefit from being revisited when the variables have changed. When time has passed and people have grown and the specific circumstances that made the original conclusion necessary have shifted in ways that the conclusion made at a specific moment in time could not have accounted for. And an energy appearing here is the suggestion that some of the variables may have shifted, that the landscape of this particular silence may look somewhat different now than it did when it began. Not necessarily different enough to change everything, but different enough that Virgo's own discernment, applied freshly, honestly, without the influence of the original hurt, might arrive at a slightly different picture than the one that the silence has been maintaining. This reflection invites you to consider what Virgo's most unguarded, most honest, most present moment discernment actually says about this person and this connection right now. Not the version filtered through the protection of the silence, but the version available when the protection is temporarily set aside and the question is simply asked, what is actually true here, now, today? The closing energy of this reflection carries something that feels characteristically Virgo in the best sense of that energy. Thoughtful, precise, genuinely oriented toward what is true rather than what is comfortable. There is no pressure here toward any particular outcome. No suggestion that the silence must be broken or that it should continue or that either of those options is inherently superior to the other. What is being offered is simply the quality of honest attention that Virgo is, at the deepest level, genuinely capable of. The willingness to look at something clearly, to apply the full, unfiltered quality of Virgo perception to a question that has been managed rather than examined for long enough that a fresh examination may reveal something genuinely useful. You are someone who tends to know things, not loudly, not with the certainty that demands an audience, but in that quiet, precise, entirely reliable way that Virgo knows things. The inner compass that has been tracking the truth of a situation, even when the mind was busy constructing explanations for why the truth might be otherwise. And what that compass says about this particular silence, this particular person, this particular unfinished thing that is information worth listening to more than any external voice, more than the official narrative, more than the protection the silence was designed to provide. And perhaps the most honest thing that can be offered in the closing of this reflection is simply this: the question of what to do, whether to reach toward this connection or to allow the silence to continue, whether to revisit or to release, is not one that belongs to anyone outside of you. It belongs entirely to your own discernment, to the specific, unsubstitutable quality of understanding that you have developed through living with this situation in the complexity of its full reality. Nobody else has access to all of the variables. Nobody else carries the full picture, and nobody else is therefore in a position to tell you what the honest answer is. Only you have that. Only you know what the silence has cost and what it has protected and what, if anything, has shifted in the territory that makes a different kind of knowing possible now. This reflection invites you to consider what it would feel like to approach this unfinished thing, not with the intention of any particular outcome, not with a decision already made, but simply with the quality of open, honest, genuinely present attention that Virgo is capable of at its very best. And what that quality of attention might reveal, that the management of the silence has been making difficult to see. Your own discernment, applied honestly to this moment, is the most reliable guide available to you. Trust it. Let it do what it does best. And let whatever it reveals be the beginning of whatever needs to happen next, whether that is movement towards something or the settled, genuinely complete peace of a silence that has been fully examined and freely chosen rather than simply maintained.